Father David, I remember back a few years ago, and again, it was only about a month or two before the war broke out, actually. So it was very close to that moment. But I remember hearing your background, and you have a fascinating background, and in some senses, your background is so interesting and relevant to our exploration of, Israel, Palestine, Gaza, etc., and the different religions and cultures at play there. So, do you want to just, as a way of intro, just tell us a bit about yourself, what your background is, etc.?
Okay, so thanks, Justin. My background probably has three significant elements and then a little more. So, first of all, in terms of very, very formative influences on my life, my family is a family of Jews from Germany who fled Germany in 1936 for reasons that are quite obvious. The people who did not flee never came out alive. So my own direct ancestors, meaning my grandparents, found refuge in South Africa. But anyway, this identity of being Jewish German refugees is very, very significant in how I grew up, the stories that I heard, the consciousness that started to grow in me. So the second element is, of course, South Africa. And we're talking about South Africa. I was born in 1962. I lived there full time for the first 15 years of my life. And there, of course, it was a South Africa where we were part of the privileged white rulers, the small minority of white people in South Africa who retained complete domination over society, economy, and the political structures. And so I grew up in this apartheid system where, thanks be to God, my parents and my school gave us a very, very strong consciousness of the injustice in that system. And so at the age of 15, this would have been in 1977, 1976 was another very powerful outbreak of protest by Black students against the white apartheid regime. And just a few days before I left, the South African government murdered one of the leading Black consciousness leaders by the name of Steve Biko. And on the 15th of September, I arrived in Jerusalem. So this is the third very important part of my the formative elements of who I am. I arrived in Israel and then did a part of my schooling, the last 3 years of my schooling in Israel, moving backwards and forwards, 1977, 78, and 79, between Jerusalem and South Africa, falling in love with Jerusalem, not wanting to go there before I went there, but then falling in love with the city, not so much the land, not so much the ideology that animates many Jews in their orientation towards that land, but falling in love with the reality of this incredibly vibrant and very, very diverse city. And so as soon as I finished high school, I decided then to go and live in Jerusalem. By that time, I had already encountered the person of Jesus Christ and was on my way, a long way, towards becoming a Christian. The long way was partly because of my parents' struggle with my decision. So in the beginning, really not understanding, my mother's first reaction being, how can you join them after what they did to us? So very much that Jewish framing of an understanding of who the Christians were for Jews in history, and me making a promise that I would do nothing for 10 years. And then after 10 years passed, being now, of course, fully an Israeli citizen, part of our Jewish Israeli society, then asking the church to be baptized and being told that I had to wait another 2 years. And when I was finally allowed to be baptized after 2 years of instruction, I then revealed to the priest who had prepared me, a Jesuit priest, that I wanted to be a Jesuit, and was then told that I had to wait 3 years. So during those 3 years, I completed my doctoral studies, which focused on one element within the Palestinian question in Palestine, Israel. And now I need to backtrack a little to explain why this became such a central question in my own life. And that is, shortly after moving to Jerusalem, I met a person who remains my closest friend. And that person not only became my closest friend, but also facilitated my becoming a part of his own family. So he is a Muslim Palestinian. And so me, as now an Israeli Jew, became part of a Muslim Palestinian family and was very much exposed to the story of this particular person, whose name is Usama, Usama's family, and of course Usama's own people living under occupation and dealing with this influx of Jewish refugees that had fled to Palestine and had not chosen, in fact, to immigrate. Immigrate means you come to a society that exists, you search for ways to integrate. Of course, the way that Jews came to Palestine, facilitated by an ideological movement called Zionism, was to create their own society in Palestine. And that actually has involved, since 1917, very, very strongly after 1948, when the State of Israel was established, it has meant the demolition of Palestinian society and in its place erecting a Jewish Israeli society found for the most part on the ruins of Palestinian society. So, Justin, this is a little bit my story and where I come into this interview with you, meaning that I am a Jewish Israeli with German roots and South African roots, but a very strong identity in terms of being Jewish, but a Jew who has become a Christian, and then very importantly, a Jewish Israeli who is deeply in relationship with the Palestinian people.
Incredibly rich and complex history that you carry, David. Very. How long? You talk about your friend and how his family became your family to an extent. How long were you living there? Were you integrally part of that Muslim family? I mean, obviously you still are to today, that sounds like. But what age were you when that journey began?
So I was 16, 17 when the journey began. I was 15 when I arrived in Jerusalem, 16, 17 when I met Usama. And this journey continues. One of the big challenges, of course, was taking seriously, I could have ignored it, but taking seriously the invitation to become part of the family. My adopted mother, my Muslim mother, Usama, the mother of Usama, speaks no language other than Arabic. So that was the first challenge, to become fluent in Arabic. And of course, what that meant is that I no longer needed the mediation of outsiders to tell me what Palestinian Arabs were thinking, what they were writing, what they were saying, because I had direct exposure. The second thing, of course, that was very, very important was that this family is a family of very pious Muslims. So it was becoming familiar with Islam, and not only in some kind of theoretical way, but in the daily life of Muslims, prayers, and almost from the beginning, when I set out to study Arabic, I would sit often with Usama to read the Qur'an in order to improve my Arabic. It was a linguistic exercise. But of course, I was exposed to Usama as a Muslim reading the Qur'an and explaining to me also not only what it meant, but also what it meant in a very, very existential sense in his own life. And it meant accompanying Usama to the mosque, sitting in the mosque while he prayed, So it was really the opening of a new world, not only on the question of Palestine, but on the question of Arab civilization, Muslim religion, and of course, the whole opening to the Arab world. That was deepened when I entered the Society of Jesus, because I very much wanted to be integrated into the Society of Jesus in the Middle East. And so that was finally accepted, and I was able to spend 2 wonderful years in Egypt, living in an Arab country, part of the broader Arab Muslim world. Of course, there being part of the Christian community. I was in a monastery of Jesuits, teaching in a Jesuit high school in my second year there. And so this has become a very integral part of who I am, an exposure to this culture. I love the music. I love the literature. And so, yeah, parallel to my Israeli identity, being part of an Israeli society that also I love very dearly, the Hebrew language, which I love, and Israeli literature, cinema. So again, I suppose it sounds in some sense a little schizophrenic, but I try to live it as a real privilege to be able to be rooted in this society which is at war with itself, and that is Palestine, Israel.
It's yeah, well, you sit in a remarkable position, David. It's remarkable, and just for our listeners, when you talk about the Society of Jesus, that's one way of referring to the Jesuits, isn't it?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
David, I wonder if we uh, just explore them for a few moments. I'm interested. You're obviously in Jerusalem. You've your life and your relationships, your family is there in many senses across the land. I feel like many of us in New Zealand, since the so-called peace process, and it'd be interesting what you think of that. But what's happened since then, and what's your view on in relationship to the what is happening in Gaza, what's happening now in Israel? Where is this relationship up to? Because we were every night it was on our news, but now with the so to speak peace process, it's sort of dropped off a bit, and we hear about a few things about Trump's plan, but I'm really interested, really, how it has played out and what's your views on the state of it now.
So, Justin, I need to profess profound ignorance. I have no idea what you're talking about when you say a peace process. I'm assuming you mean PIECE, a peace. We want a piece of this and we want a piece of that. There is no peace process. Mr. Trump, of course, took credit for bringing thousands of years of warfare to an end in the Middle East, but that is a figment of his imagination. And I think it is very, very unfortunate that what is going on in Gaza has dropped off the news, because it's a lie. So let's look over what has happened. The conflict began. And here again, many people will kind of say, oh, on the 7th of October, 2023. No, not at all. The conflict began in 1917 when the British decided, in their great wisdom as colonial rulers, to establish in Palestine a Jewish homeland. And of course, that was a first act of violence against an indigenous people. And you living in New Zealand, and I think people all over the world know what colonialism is. And this was British colonialism making a decision that the small group of Jews who did not want to immigrate to Palestine. The question is not immigration to Palestine. They wanted to replace Palestine with a Jewish society. So the conflict begins then, and the conflict reaches its peak in 1947, 1948, when the State of Israel is then created, established, not now by the British, but by the world community. The world community that took a decision in the light of what had happened during the Second World War, when we as Jews were exterminated by Europeans, 6 million Jews murdered and millions more homeless. The international community made the decision that the Jews should have a home, we should have a home, and it was quite okay to take away the home of the Palestinians. Again, this is not a question of whether Jews are linked to the land. They are linked to the land from a religious and spiritual point of view, and even if you want, from some kind of national point of view. But, and this is where the huge problem comes in, they did not immigrate to the land as people who were seeking to become a part of the land. They came to the land to transform the land into something else, to make it an ethnocentric Jewish homeland, and to turn the Palestinian Arab population that is indigenous to this land into strangers, into people who didn't belong. And 1948, 750,000 people were driven from their homes, from their land, and became refugees. And then in 1967, as this state received the support of the powers that be in the world, the rest of Palestine was occupied. Remember, we met in Tantur. Tantur is part of those territories that were occupied after 1967. And so now Israel had complete control of the territory of Palestine. The half of the Palestinian people live in exile. And this is at the very heart of what led to the more recent round of the conflict on the 7th of October, 2023. So the idea that everything started in 2023 is nonsense. It's an ongoing conflict that is more than 100 years old, in which the Palestinians have been progressively pushed out of their homes and pushed out of their land. And so what happened in 2023, the extreme violence of the 7th of October, when Palestinians, militants came into Israel and murdered 1,200 people, was an incredible shock to Jewish Israelis. They had never encountered such a degree of violence. What happened after the 7th of October was that the horror of the 7th of October was visited daily on the Palestinian people in Gaza, as Gaza was piece by piece destroyed. That's why I thought if you're talking about peace, it's piece by piece destruction. What happened in October 2025, after more than 2 years of incessant violence, which was predominantly Israeli violence against the Palestinian people in Gaza, is that President Trump imposed a ceasefire. And President Trump, of course, has incredible power because Israel is totally dependent on United States support. And so he imposed an ending to the huge destruction. But, and this we need to know, the destruction continues. Day by day, people are killed, buildings are destroyed. And worst of all, in the ruins of Gaza, what's left of Gaza, and over 85% of Gaza is in ruins, but in those ruins are living 2 million people, over 2 million people, exposed to the cold, exposed to disease, exposed to starvation, because until now, and perhaps this will change as we speak, because the Israelis said they are not willing to allow the borders to be open until the last Israeli body is retrieved, and that happened yesterday. The last Israeli body was retrieved. Will now the Israelis open up the Gaza Strip so that aid can come in, building materials can come in, and most important of all, people can go into Gaza to see with their own eyes what has happened, because Israel has not allowed anyone into Gaza, and that includes foreign media, to actually go in and find what has been going on over the last 2 years. What is the extent of what many are calling a genocide in Gaza? Now, Justin, I'm going to add that while the world was focused on Gaza and now no longer focused on Gaza, Israel was continuing in a very, very, very powerful and violent way with the colonization of the other part of the Palestinian territories, and that is the West Bank. And more and more properties have been confiscated, refugee camps have been destroyed, people have been made homeless, but also alongside that, the official acts of the Israeli state, the Jewish settler population in the West Bank, a part of it has gone on the rampage through villages and towns. Just yesterday, we as a small Christian community received news that the settlers had attacked a Palestinian family in the town of Bir Zayt. The elderly mother is in hospital. 3 of her sons were arrested for resisting settlers who came on the rampage through their lands, destroying their olive trees. And so the violence is enormous, enormous.
Right, so there's no sense since October last year that actually anything has got better.
Well, the massive killing, the massive destruction in Gaza stopped. So it was just now, on a low flame, killing and destroying every day. But the situation in the West Bank has gotten much worse, much worse.